Good morning or good afternoon, as the case may be. This is Randall Rudd. I'm going to be your professor for this course, and I thought it might be helpful for you to sort of understand where I'm coming from. So, we're going to spend a few minutes going over the path I followed, and it may be something you can relate to, or maybe not. But seeing as how we're all from Texas or in Texas, this may be interesting to you to how one person's journey. Um, just to get some sense of one person's journey into the business. So this is called the Introduction Rudd Career. To begin with, I think this is important, at least to me, because I still remember how hard it was to get into business. It just seemed to me, and I think it proved to be the case, no doors were open for me at the time. Now, this is long ago, but when there were very few film schools out there and you sort of had to make your own path because the whole business of creative filmmaking was a whole new concept. It had been entirely tucked away in Hollywood and in people who, the children of Hollywoodans and so on. So having usurpers coming from other parts of the country was really quite rare in Hollywood at that point in time. But I was bound and determined to make film, as you'll see. And also, why am I teaching this now? I think it's important to give back, especially if you've had some good fortune, as have I, in the business. And what's interesting is I've asked several people to speak to you as a class, and of the 20 or so people I approached, only one said no. And that was just because he had retired for 5 years or so and felt like he was too out of it to really say anything relevant. But I was amazed at the generosity of those. And the general concept was, we'd like to give back. We were lucky or fortunate, or for whatever reason, they want to do something for students. And then also, students have worked with this hard. You want to give them every advantage, because I know from my experience with, especially with computer graphics, it is not easy. It is not for everyone. I would say that 2D animation or even stop motion animation, which was, to me at least, a much easier path than going to computer graphics. My view of animation as a career is the more you know, the better chance you have. The more knowledgeable you are of how the business is, the better chance you're going to have. And I want to try and give you guys every advantage I possibly can if you wish to follow this career in animation. Creative people tend to reinvent themselves. This is kind of an interesting concept, but about every 20 years, I tended to go in a different direction, as I'm always staying within the umbrella of motion pictures or animation. But I would go off and be on this side of I would be a client for a while, and then I'd be the on the other side, the production side, and I've sort of run that balance the whole time, going from one side to the other. And it may turn out that once you get into the business, you may find another area, or you may evolve into another area. And that's part of what this course is about, is to give you some sense of, well, that's pretty cool. I think I'll check that out. Maybe I want to do that. Because not everybody is destined to be a Pixar animator. In fact, very few people are ever destined to do that. I always think of it as there are a dozen jobs in the world that might give you that, maybe more, maybe as many as 36 jobs that are that. So you have to be flexible. You have to be willing to, okay, I'll do this if that isn't going to happen. And the funny thing is too, is I see that we seldom end up where we start. I thought I was going to do this and do that, and before it was all over, I had evolved or moved into different aspects. And sometimes you go where the opportunities are, and they may not be where you thought you initially were going to wind up. So you'll see that things move around on you. What I hope to give you, and what I hope you can get out of this class, is a diversified interest and expertise. I want you to know a broad scope, what fits under the entire umbrella of the animation industry. Also, I wanted that increases your value to employees. The more you know, the better you're going to be, because really employers are not looking for that person that says, gee, I don't know anything about that. You really are better off saying, either I know or I'll find out. The other thing is what you have to work for, especially being a newcomer in the film industry. I say film animation industry, generally the first one in is the first one out, because if the economy begins to wobble, you may be the first person that's been being shown the door. What you really need to work on is resisting expendability. If you remember the old Star Trek TV show, the guys that wore red shirts were the expendables. They were going to die before the episode was over. You don't want to be wearing one of those red jerseys. You need to be of value, and you're constantly in the quest to increase your value to your employer. The other thing that you need to be is open-minded, open to change. I can tell you this from personal experience. The people I worked with that seemed to be the most open-minded about the business were the ones who moved at a much faster rate and succeeded at a higher level than the ones who were sort of stuck in their old ways. So keep that in mind as we go through this course. Allow yourself to stay in the business, regardless of where and what you end up doing. That's just one thing I keep wanting to drive. I had very specific ideas of exactly what I was going to be doing and where in my career. And though ironically, I did end up in that very chair I wanted to be, I had to do that. I had to get there by going through several other avenues. So maybe we'll talk about that a little more as this goes on. Who am I? I'm a kid that grew up in Abilene, Texas. No big deal. It wasn't exactly a small town, but certainly it was no metropolis, where you had three options. You could either go in the oil business, as my father was, or you can go in ranching and farming. That's pretty much it. There were no jobs for the arts in a smallish town like that. But luckily, I had a mother who wanted to go become a New York dancer. She didn't, so she therefore tried to live her life through me, which meant I was exposed to lots of the arts early on, and I kind of, I guess you could say, I had a big cheerleader in my background with my mother, because she was very, very involved in not making me not settle for good enough. She was always into do something bigger and better. This is a strange thing. This is a click to add title. This is a Tinker Toy set. I don't know how many of you had one of these as a kid, but this is kind of my first indication that I might have something different. My grandmother bought this for my brother, who was 2 years older than I and me. And my brother Ronnie made that fan that you see there. And I made a working record player, literally a hand crank, granted, but you could play records on it. And my grandmother was so amazed. She called my parents and my grandparents and said, "You've got to see what Randy's made." And for a 5-year-old, I guess that was a big deal. But to me, it was pretty obvious. I just wanted to make a record player, and my grandmother didn't have one. So, and I had a record, so I was bound and determined to play that record. So that was kind of an indication that maybe I had something that I should develop as I got older. And this was something that I saved my money for in the 4th grade. It was actually a hand-cranked movie projector. And boy, it was crude, as you can see. I still have this thing. And you put your cartoons on the, you put the reel of the cartoon. In fact, this Popeye cartoon, on the little projector, and you turn the crank. And I remember my dad, I came home and said, "Hey Dad, look what I got. It's really cool." And I threaded up the 8mm film and started turning the crank, and it was just blurring through there. What wasn't happening was this particular model, for whatever reason, the pull down mechanism wasn't quite where it ought to be. It was nothing more than just a little wooden clip, a spring. And my dad took his finger and pushed down on that spring, and said, "Now try it, Randy." And all of a sudden it starts going, it starts making projector sounds. And what began happening was the persistence of vision occurred, where the film was actually stopping for, let's say, an 1/18 of a second. And then the next picture would come in. And when that happened, all of a sudden this blurred line becomes Popeye fighting a bull, as it turns out. And then I realized, oh, I get it. Animation is nothing but a series of drawings that are back to back or sequential. And not only this made me realize, oh my God, I've been doing flip books all my life, and this is nothing but a flip book. And so once that happened, I began getting very interested in making my own cartoons, which is a kind of a logical extension. In the 6th grade, I got the ultimate present under the tree. My brother told me I had been given a rifle and a skeet shooting machine, which I couldn't be less interested in, but it turns out it was a movie projector and camera and a screen once I took the wrapping paper off. And that's when I started collecting films and really studying what was going on with movies. And it was a wonderful thing. In fact, as soon as I got this, I began making films with my friends. I would storyboard, and didn't even know about storyboarding, but I would make storyboards and we would act out the shots. And I didn't have any means of editing at the time, so it all had to be done in camera. But I was making scripted movies in the 6th grade with my friends, which is kind of a bizarre thing. In the 8th grade, my first professional job, this is really bizarre. I'm that guy that you see with his arms stretched out. I was a monster in a horror movie that still plays. It's been on Mystery Science Theater and so on. But this is it's called Teenage Psycho Meets Bloody Mary, or its original title was The Incredibly Strange Creatures Who Stopped Living and Became Zombies. So if you're, I think Riff Tracks has done it as well. But if you ever want to see that, that was my $35 a day I made on that shoot, and that impressed me and made me decide that motion pictures was what I wanted to be in and do. I also had a rock band back then. I was a jock, but I also loved playing music. So I ended up. This is several bands in, but I had a band called Chicken Little and His Fabulous Egg Whites because it was a terrible name, but you would never forget it. So instead of trying to be cool, our band really made fun of other bands, and it worked. We started playing big shows, and whenever a big act would come to town, they would book us as the warm-up act, and we would make fun of the band that would follow us, and the bands loved it. So we had a nice, good run. But the other thing is, I told you earlier that I got my friends to be in movies. Well, the band, each one of these guys were actors in their own right, really hams. They thought nothing. They would not hold back on stage, so therefore they would not hold back in front of a camera. And so we made movies together, and one of them, our bigger epics, was a thing called Chicken Little Walks Among Us. Our band was named Chicken Little and the Egg Whites, so it was Chicken Little double promoting. This is the DVD of the movie with the original poster that I drew on the front there. But this thing launched us into a whole different realm of, that is, you can actually make money off of movies. In fact, we made a good bit of money off of this silly little movie when ran it in the local theaters and all the high schools and the junior highs, and it ended up generating quite a bit of profit. But it also it launched us in the business of making movies. So we started making Monty Python, Saturday Night Live type films, and did them all the way through college and then a little bit past. Here's some scenes from Chicken Little Walks Among Us, where you can see the obvious fakery of but this is the chicken actually destroys the local teen hangout in one scene. So we built the local teen hangout, and people got a big kick out of seeing their city destroyed. These are some more films that we did. We made films on rock festivals that we went to or performed in, and did musicals. And absolutely wasn't afraid at all to take on. We did an Elvis movie called Travel That Gravel Road Baby, and other silliness that we did along the way. And then I ended up going to North Texas State at the time, which is now University of North Texas, for 2 years, because I had a pretty advanced film department. That way I could get my hands on motion picture gear, big time gear, immediately, rather than waiting until my junior year. So for 2 years I went to UNT, and then I ended up at Texas Tech because I wanted to also get a lot of background in advertising. I had learned, believe it or not, through student council posters, the effectiveness of advertising. I never made a poster for someone who didn't win, and I cheated a lot. I really did something that would get students to line up to look at the posters, and so I learned advertising combined with filmmaking could be a pretty good thing. If I ever wanted to legitimize instead of being one of those gypsy filmmakers, I could be an advertising executive and come up with my own content, which turned out to be a pretty good call. So I made some films when I was at Texas Tech, including a film called 3 Minute Afternoon that was very happily was run during the halftime nationally on the Gator Bowl, in fact, to show, I guess you could say I sort of stop motion filmed the entire band performing, and virtually every band member in the Texas Tech band bought a copy. So I sold a lot of those things. So that was a good call. This is I came to San Antonio because I was offered a job at a company called Chromalloy making safety films, which lasted all of 2 months, and then they laid off the entire department. So then I started trying to figure, well, what am I going to do now? So I became a freelancer, and I started making cartoons for local advertising agencies. I say cartoons, I mean animated commercials. And here are some of the projects I did along the way, and that turned out to be that's how I sort of got into the business locally. That middle picture I put in there because that is kind of the way it really was back then. That was taken something like 3 a.m. With a tight deadline, and I was animating an explosion for a Showtime Open, which we did for it. Here's just some more filmmaking stuff that was of that time. This is in the mid to the late 70s. I started a little company, if you look in the lower left, with those 3 guys there called Texas National Productions, whatever that meant. And there was a big company here in town called Hayes Productions, which is over on what's now the Hemisphere Plaza. And they were doing some very good work, nationally recognized work. And I wanted to get in there. So I started doing animation and so on for this little Texas National thing we had. And it got to the point where I was cutting into so much business for Hayes Productions that they ended up hiring me to basically kill the competition. But it's what I had to do to get my foot in the door, because that animation director there saw my reel. I went over and showed it to him, and he was totally intimidated. And luckily, the president and the founder of that film company happened to come in during the screening and sat in the back of the theater room and watched my reel, never said a word. And about 6 months later, I had replaced that guy because I guess he was impressed where my would-be boss wasn't impressed. And here's some early commercials from that time. That's actually my daughter, that little girl who's peeking her head up from that center thing. We did commercials for Piggly Wiggly and so on. And there I'm about to destroy a building in the upper right hand. We had to have an earthquake. So this is me setting stuff with the master prop maker. And in the center, that's my wife and I and our daughter standing in the middle of a U.S. Homes set that was sort of the precursor of computer graphics. Then I went to work for a company in Austin that was dabbling in computer animation. Now, we had worked at Hayes Productions. We had a computer-assisted animation stand, which ran on something like 19 different servo motors, made a lot of funny sounds when it was operating, but it was computer programmed, but it didn't make raster images. It was basically an automated camera system, very sophisticated for the time. We could do fancy slit scans and stuff like you would have seen in 2001: A Space Odyssey, stuff like that. But I was very intrigued by this group in Austin, so I went to work for them to see how far we could push this computer graphics thing. And that was a good gamble, because this little group, sleepy little group in Austin, I was called one day to come interview for a position at Paramount Pictures to run their television commercial and computer graphics division, a thing they called Omnibus. And so I said, yeah, I'll take that job. And I moved to Hollywood. And Studio G and Paramount Pictures, this is where we were. We took an entire soundstage, and you'll see why in a minute. But this is, at the same time all this was going on, the earliest signs of computer graphics and motion pictures were these two pictures actually. Westworld, which has been remade, and also a picture called Looker, where there was real images, raster images made. And then what really broke it open was another one, the big one. I don't know if it's recognized today as it should be, but this is a picture called Tron, and this really opened things up. And here's an interesting little scene. And this is a scene from Tron that contains what we call the lightsaber. So this is made on a thing called the Foonly, which was a huge computer to make computer graphics. And you'll see that in a minute. But this is what the Foonly was capable of generating.
We have transport.
Wow.
Copy, Blue Leader. Copy, Blue Leader. This is Gold 1 to Gold 2 and 3. Split up. Take them one on one.
when you guys are invited.
Got it.
Ready? Ready.
So long, sucker!
So that's Tron, and that made a huge impact on everything. Suddenly, people took computer graphics seriously, where they maybe had not before. But there was no ignoring that this. I mean, to be in the business at the time, there was before Tron and after Tron. It was a huge, monumental uh, event in computer graphics. I mentioned earlier the Foonly computer. Well, this is it. Everything that you see that's blue-ish, grayish. This is Studio G, Paramount Pictures, where we have some VAX 11 780 computers that you see down there. But the center and the back row were, for the most part, the Foonly, which was on massive computers. It's the only one I've ever seen that actually had real blinking lights that meant something. And it performed better when it was hot, which is really strange. So rather than keep that room cold, most post-production facilities at the time always had cold rooms where they kept their gear. Well, this one was hot because the Foonly ran better in the heat, which is really weird. That's a picture of me at the time standing on the bridge with the Foonly behind me. This was at the same time we were working on a picture there called Flight of the Navigator. At least that's what it was released as. And some kids actually know that picture. I was kind of amazed because to me it wasn't that big a deal at the time, but some people thought it was big, and it actually was in some ways. I'll talk to you about it in just a moment. But these are some pictures from my days at Paramount. Again, another shot of the Foonly. To the right of the Foonly is Bob Hoffman, who's an unsung hero to computer graphics. But Bob came up with texture mapping, and he came up with reflection mapping, which was absolutely astonishing at the time. That's what enabled us to make a chrome spaceship reflect the environment it was in, though it was actually never in that environment, but we were able to map a reflection of which was a totally convincing effect and which had never been done before. And that's all done by this hippie named Bob Hoffman, who sometimes wore shoes. And when he did, it was usually his sandals. And here he's wearing sandals with socks, which was really unheard of. And these are the little workstations that you see all around. In the center, there's Jeff Kleiser, who is a buddy of mine who came from New York. His brother Randall was the fellow who directed Grease and also directed Flight of the Navigator. That's one of the reasons why we got the gig, because Randall and Jeff were brothers, and Randall was very comfortable hanging out and working with us. And that's what a facility would look like at that time. And then there was a company called Able and Associates, and Able and Associates was the zenith, the highest point, on that pantheon of greatness. Nobody could touch Robert Able and Associates. You guys have probably never heard of them, but they were really advancing the whole world of graphics. I mean, their commercials for companies like Levi's and 7-Up, as you see in a moment, were spectacular for the time. You know, if you could see what they were being compared to, they were still on when black, and some television commercials were still crude and in black and white. And these guys came along from Hollywood and really changed the whole game. Here's an example of one of their early commercials.
7-Up, 7-Up, we see the light of 7-Up.
We couldn't have made it through the day without something to show the way, without something to keep us going.
And you can't make it through the night if you don't have some kind of light that's showing.
7-Up, 7-Up, we see the light of 7-Up, 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 we see the light of 7-Up, 7-Up, 7-Up.
That was That was a mind blower for the when that I would imagine that came out somewhere around 1980, and it was just staggering compared to anything else that you'd see. And the funny thing is, that was created using computerized animation stands and some raster graphics, but hardly anyone knew it at the time. This is sort of where it evolved. Abel went on to make a commercial that was spectacular. Also, another something that changed the entire playing field, and that was this commercial called, I believe we called it Brilliance, for aluminum can industry. But it's worth looking at in keeping in mind that this is we were dealing with stone axes and steam powered computers at the time, but this is kind of an amazing piece of work. I'm very proud of it to this day.
Even in the year 3000, the question will be, what's for dinner? The answer will be in a package that saves energy, nutrients, and trouble. A package that can last the 3-year journey to Jupiter and back and back. Even in the year 3000, we see the brilliance of food in cans.
And if you think, I mean, we actually had to bring a model in and have her perform with markings on her and take our computer, our computer motion information visually from a piece of film, basically rotoscoping. It was long before we had motion capture, long before, and it was done the hard way. Here are some other films that made a dent. As you can see, The Last Starfighter was one that was done by Digital Productions, who eventually got a company that was gobbled up by Omnibus, as was Robert Abel. And Explorers was a wonderful little picture that nobody saw. It was could have been a great film, but the Paramount executive pool they were going to get their bonus based on moving this movie up in its rotation from I think it was going to be a spring release, but they said you were going to make it a Christmas release, which meant that it was basically sabotaged. They got their bonuses, but the film was never anything like what it might have been had they not dabbled in it. Worked on some Star Trek pictures, which was a lot of fun with Leonard Nimoy on Star Trek 4. He was the director, and he was in our offices, and we hung out quite a bit and did some fun work with him on what would it look like for humans to be moving at light speed, which we all thought was a fascinating thing. But we had a fellow there named from the Jet Propulsion Labs who says, you're moving at light speed right now. It's no big deal. But we were so intimidated by that. And Flight of the Navigator was obviously a fun movie to work on. And let's see, here are some other pictures. It's interesting. I remember when the guys came in and wanted us to do RoboCop. And at the time we were working on Explorers, and I was convinced that Explorers was going to be such a big hit that we weren't going to waste our time with something as trivial as RoboCop, which is a bad mistake. And same thing happened. Can you do CGI DeLorean? I think we actually did a test of the DeLorean. But then we decided, no, we don't want to compromise, whatever we were working on for a film that was already in big trouble. Back to the Future, at least the gossip on the Paramount lot was that's a picture that's going nowhere. They just replaced their lead actor 6 weeks into shooting. And they, of all things, they got Michael J. Fox, who everyone knew on the lot because he was in a TV series, and we didn't take him seriously. And turns out Michael J. Fox was a good bet, and we really missed out on that one too. But that happens sometimes. On the right is a picture called Brainstorm. A guy named Douglas Trumbull, who did 2001: A Space Odyssey, was at that time he was red hot as a director, and they had this actress Natalie Wood who. Unfortunately, she drowned in a boating accident most of the way through filming, but they really needed to have her in one shot that they didn't have. And we did some early tests and decided that computers were not ready to replicate human beings, which is interesting because somebody had put a false, talk about fake news. There had been a piece of puffery or fake news that had been put in the Hollywood Reporter that some company had done a movie where they replaced real actors with computer actors, and the industry believed it. And all of a sudden, and that was part of my job, was to go around and convince the movie studios to use computer graphics. Suddenly I had this enormous problem that they were very resentful, and so were the actors and Screen Actors Guild, so on, very intimidated with this idea of these these guys that are going to come in and make their computers replace all the actors. Well, it wasn't true. And if we may someday see that, but we're still some distance away, but we can talk about that more in a little bit. But anyway, the Natalie Wood scene was that was at the point where we said, now we aren't ready to, aren't able to do that now. This I thought you'd just find interesting. This is a storyboard I did for the 75th anniversary of Paramount Pictures, the screen, the logo that you saw for 30 years or so. This, such as it is, this is the original storyboard that was presented to Frank Mancuso, who's the head of Paramount Pictures at the time. And it wasn't any fancier than this, but I sold him on the idea of having pearlescent letters. He thought that was just so sexy. He wanted to have Paramount look like that. So we did that. And there's a newer version of it now that's entirely CGI. This one was done on a huge set. We did do so, the stars were flown via CGI, but the mountain itself is a real set of, I think, something like 50, 60 feet across. One interesting little anecdote I'll tell you is that the snow that's on the top of the mountain there, we couldn't get the snow to look right because the camera has to come within a half inch of it. And it was just looking chunky and horrible. We were very discouraged. And finally they said, Randy, come, get in your car, drive out to the set. You got to see what we have here. And I walked in and the snow looked amazing. I said, what is this stuff? And they said, I said, where'd you get it? And they said, we got it at McDonald's. I said, you mean the restaurant McDonald's? Oh yeah. It's the stuff it's made of microscopic plastic bubbles. And I said, what are they doing with that? And I said, that's what they use to thicken their milkshakes. As you drink the milkshake, the plastic bubble dissolves in your digestive system. But that was what we used to create the snow on the Paramount Mountain. And it's also a damning indictment against McDonald's. If you're thinking about drinking a milkshake, that's exactly what you're drinking. This is an interesting photograph. It's the last moment of omnibus computer graphics. Here we basically had all of the talent in the world in computer graphics working for one company at one time. And they apparently, the big muck-to-mucks got into some sort of scuffle with the Bank of Canada on some big loan. Well, the Bank of Canada tried to do a hostile takeover because they thought this company was going to be, well, at the time it was the ILM of the industry before ILM quite existed. And it turns out that it created, it killed the company. In one day, everyone was brought into this room here. That's part of them. And we're told the security guys are going to watch you all walk out. Do not go to your desks. We don't trust you. You're probably going to steal stuff. And that was the end of that omnibus computer graphics role, which is we made a lot of history at the time, but that was the end of that. And then I went into a company called Energy Productions and had some fun doing projects. I did the effects on a picture called Vice Versa. But this is an interesting story. I've worked on 6 or 8 pictures, never had my name in one. In this case, I worked for 6 months and I didn't learn, this is the 3rd time, I didn't learn until I went to see the movie that my name was not in the credits. In this case, mine was taken off and the name of my boss was put on instead. He had nothing to do with it, but nonetheless, he got the credit. And that's just the way it goes. It's funny. You can see the guy who drove donuts to the crew one afternoon gets his name in the movie, but at that point in time, movie credits were very negotiable, and it was very unfair the way that it was done. I worked on really the beginning of Disney's involvement with computer graphics. I did some broke down how some scenes could be done in computer graphics for The Little Mermaid, which is an interesting project. And I was the effects director for a television series called Moonlighting, which is shot at 20th Century Fox, and those are some pictures of me working with them. I did some fun projects. You may or may not have heard of Siegfried and Roy, who were 2 very, very, very famous magicians at the time. This is a sort of a bizarre little story. They hired me to do their television. If I was thinking, what am I going to do? I mean, they're doing all this wonderful magic stuff. It turns out in that center, you see these 2 magicians standing on either side of the castle at Disneyland. And I went into the edit bay and I said, okay, guys, what do you want me to do? And they said, well, make the castle disappear. I said, wait a minute. You say on your television shows that no special effects were used in the making or whatever. I forget how they phrased it. And they said, look, we're magicians. What do you expect? Do you expect us to make this castle disappear? Really? No, you're going to make it disappear. Just, get a paint box and do what you need to do. And I learned a lesson about magicians that day. And that is, they lie. Of course they lie. That's their whole gig, but it was an interesting thing to learn. Okay, and here are some other. Oh yeah, this is when I went to work for moved back to San Antonio, and I was hired by an ex-child actor uh, in his company called Electric Ideas, and what we did was made trailers, or previews, some people call them, primarily for Disney, but we also did work for Miramax at the time and 20th. And these are some of the pictures that we did. In fact, the one on the upper left, Pretty Woman, is kind of an interesting story. When we got hold of it, it was called 2000, and that referred to the amount of money that Julia Roberts, who was a sex worker, was paid per night. And we came up with the idea of using the term Pretty Woman and using the famous Roy Orbison song, and they went along with it. And so that movie got retitled and so on. And the Muppet, there's a Muppets picture there. It was kind of fun. We were charged with doing doing the preview, and in some of the scenes, for whatever reason, Gonzo character we didn't have the voice track, so I ended up voicing Gonzo for the trailer, which no one ever caught, which is kind of a fun thing to pull that away. Here's another little thing some of you may have seen. This is my original sketch for the lettering that was used for The Nightmare Before Christmas. Again, we were this is an amazing story. They were so convinced that this movie was going to fail that when Michael Eisner and Jeffrey Katzenberg came out of the Disney screening room, along with, we all watched it together for the first time, and they were absolutely despondent. They were convinced it's going to be the biggest failure in the history of Disney, so much so that they took the Disney labeling off of it and called it a Touchstone Pictures release, which was a company that they owned. They were so afraid of backlash, and wouldn't you know it, this picture has become quite an important thing to many people. I think it's a wonderful movie, but it was at one time considered the plague. This is when I started a company of my own called Rudd Creative, and luckily I still had quite a long client list from having worked with the people I'd worked with, and not just in the United States, but really all over the world. And here's a kind of an interesting thing where we shot a bullfighting commercial in Mexico for a Japanese company. And we actually had about 200 extras on that day. And I think it was in August, and it was so hot that we had to send people out to get cardboard boxes to put on the concrete seats because they were so hot. They would burn the people who were supposed to be filling the stadium. So that was a long story. We had a whole lot of fun on that one. Ended up spending the night in a Mexican jail with my clients after we were hit. Our passenger van was hit by a group of Mexican youth, and we had to do some fancy work to get out of that. But anyway, here are some more projects that I've done as Rudd Creative that some of you may have seen, some of you may recognize. The one in the middle is fairly popular because it ran for 13 years here. I agreed to do some work for a water park in New Braunfels, Schlitterbahn, and they were not doing well because their commercials featured girls in bikinis. And when they hired me to take over the account, the first thing I said was, the people who buy tickets are the mothers of children primarily. They don't want to go to a place where they're going to be a bunch of 18-year-old babes in bikinis. You need to advertise to them. And so they agreed to let me do this pilot spot, which we called Wading Pool, where I got my daughter out in the back of a house, and it well, I'll just play it for you and you'll see what I mean.
The hottest, coolest time in Texas. Come play. Schlitterbahn. Now he's been summer water park.
So that commercial ran for 13 years, and it actually made wonderful change in Schlitterbahn. They went from not having enough customers to having to build 5 new Schlitterbahn parks because the demand got so great when they started advertising to the right people. Okay, next is I was asked by Gunn Automotive here to do a commercial for them, which I did, which didn't say anything about a dealership. It just showed people enjoying their cars. And that led to a 20-year relationship with Gunn. And during that time, Gunn had acquired Tim Duncan as a spokesperson, and also Malik Rose, and certainly Manu Ginobili. And I had a great time with these guys, and we had many fun projects together. This is an interesting story, though. When first time I had Tim do a campaign, he was terrible. He was what I call a hunk of wood. That means an actor who comes out and reads the teleprompter as though he's brain dead. And Tim was just terrible. But he was having a lot of fun in between the takes because his best friend was in the studio with us, and they were joking back and forth. And I told the cameraman, keep rolling in between the takes. And I asked the friend to come over and stand right beside the camera, and said, just, I would appreciate it if you just keep Tim loosened up, keep talking to him. And so he and Tim were cracking jokes back and forth. And I ended up throwing away all of the lines that Tim read off the teleprompter, and instead using these lines that he and this guy were back and forth and having fun with. And I sent them to Tim and said, would you mind if we did these instead? Because these really show your personality. And he said, man, let's do it. So we ran this campaign, which I call bloopers. And here's one of them to give you some idea of what they were like.
Tim Duncan for Gunn Chevrolet.
I like playing with winners, like Gunn.
Gunn Chevrolet. Got that?
Not so much of a pause.
Excuse me?
Don't start until I see the camera.
Oh, so you're directing now, huh?
No.
Roll the footage.
Tim Duncan for Gunn Honda.
Action.
I like playing with a winning team, like Gunn, with Gunn, like Gunn.
With Gunn Honda, Tim?
I like playing with winners, like Gunn.
Gunn Honda, Tim. Guess what?
Start over one time.
Bingo. Roll the footage.
Tim Duncan and Gunn Honda.
That's my kind of team.
Whoa. How'd they get in here?
But you can see that's one of, I think, 8 that were in that campaign, and it was a great fun thing to do. And after that, Tim started getting some big campaigns for major car manufacturers and so on. But they all thought, oh, this guy's a great actor. Well, he did become a good actor, but at first he was rather stiff. But he learned to loosen up, and he was a terrific guy, by the way. Back in 2016. I really became convinced that virtual reality was going to be the next cinema. So I founded a company called Immersion Industries International and did a project we called the Alamo Adventure, because at the time the Alamo was, let's just say its presentation didn't live up to its history. And so I came up with the idea of let's recreate what that final siege would have been like if you were actually there in the Alamo at the time. And we brought in some very good people, including Dr. Watkins here in this department. In fact, that's how I met Adam. And we created an incredible experience that really skipped right past the whole business of gaming. We were not interested in showing virtual reality gaming. There was already a successful movement in that direction. I always saw it as a replacement for cinema. And as I was reading all these articles about how it can never be a replacement because you can't direct it and you can't do dissolves and you can't do this and you can't do that, we'd already done that. We'd already proven that it worked in this demo that we have.
Welcome. Relax. Sit comfortably and look directly forward as we allow your vision, mind, and body a moment to acclimate. Please be aware that in your next few moments, you may experience virtual sensations of flight, fear, drama, and violence, with a heightened sense of involvement. You are safe. Should you experience feelings of discomfort or require immediate assistance, simply raise your hand. If you have been fitted with a controller, you may walk about freely during your adventure. If taking a guided tour, we will control your body, altitude, and positioning only. You will have fully functioning height, head, and neck movement to look about freely. As you enter the new medium of immersion.
Virtual reality. This elusive gateway to the infinite has captivated man's imagination for millennia. Since the dawn of mankind, the need to create life, has remained a human desire through whatever medium was available at the time. We have always felt the need to visit other worlds. We've tried time and time again to unlock this gate, but the key has always been just out of reach. Until now. As technology improved, our ability to construct new worlds grew more and more powerful. No longer were our creations restricted by pen and paper, but instead, they captivated us by means of screen and speakers. Finally, the advent of the computer was a key element in the long journey, allowing us to finally access our own created worlds, yet we knew something was still missing. Until there were no barriers between us and our creations, we would never be satisfied. We deeply longed to open that last and final gate, and take our first steps into another world. So today, we invite you to do exactly that, as we take a journey into the all-new medium of immersion.
For 13 days, the Mexican army of over 4,000 soldiers has held 186 men inside the mission walls under continuous bombardment. These Alamo defenders were not soldiers, but tradesmen, farmers, ranchers, doctors, and cowboys who settled the northern frontier of Mexico by invitation of the President Santa Anna, who promised plentiful land and liberty. But once this new land became settled with people of independent spirit, the self-proclaimed dictator Santa Anna broke his promise, declared a new government, and ordered settlers to evacuate immediately. This betrayal meant the loss of their land, freedom, and independence. For those who resisted it, it meant death. For all Texan and Tejano settlers, it became the time to stand.
I tell you, I don't like this one bit. They bombard us with no pause for 12 days now, shooting us up all to hell. Until tonight. Listen, you hear that? Nothing. Not a single sound out there. Now why is that? I just don't like it. I just don't set well with me. It's too quiet. It makes me think, maybe they're... Listen, you hear something? I could swear I heard it. Nah, must just be my imagination. Gotta keep our eyes open and just hold on, because like Colonel Travis said, it's just us now. Just us. There ain't no help coming. Not now, not never. But like he said, about all we can do now is every man got to sell his life dearly to that Santa Anna. And by God, we will make him pay. Of course, I don't know what we're going to use for ammunition. We're sure as hell going to find out. I was just thinking, got 4,000 Mexican soldiers out there surrounding us. But I never felt more alone in my life.
You hear that, Captain?
My imagination don't speak Spanish. Take a look out there!
Already upon us! Sound the alarm!
Someday, although not now, someday I think virtual reality will mature from a technical standpoint, but also it will mature into realizing it is a terrific storytelling device. Here's some of the images from the movie. and it's kind of interesting. I was experimenting with having actors standing too close. And when people would watch this thing, they often would back up because this guy was right in their face at times. I even had one woman turn and run when the Mexicans came over the wall with their guns and started shooting. It was a very bizarre thing because in virtual reality, it was so convincing that you felt vulnerable. You felt like you were going to get hurt, to die. When the Mexicans came over the wall, you stood there with no gun, and it was very. I had to cut it off. That's the end of it. At the moment they come over the wall and start shooting, because it just became too much. Which is to me is a marvelous sign that virtual reality is got a humongous future. Here's a little lesson in life for you. My wife was a cartoonist, or is a cartoonist, but at the time she did cartooning for what we have in San Antonio is called the Current, I think it is. In LA, it was in Los Angeles, it was the LA Reader, and she did a comic strip for the Reader. And one of her fellow comic artists was a fellow named Matt Groening, who also did cartoons. For them. Actually, he was a music reviewer as well, but that's another story. But Matt and my wife Karen were pals. In fact, he thought she was great. He would ask her for her autograph, and at the time he was a nobody, but he was doodling around with this thing he called Life in Hell, and he asked me, Randy, would you mind coming up with a script for a TV series starring these things? And I was lukewarm on it, and I asked a friend of mine who is a screenwriter, hey, would you take a look at this? And I handed him that Life in Hell calendar, I guess. And I said, can you make something of this? And he said, yeah, I guess so. And I waited around for 2 or 3 months passed, and eventually Matt says, well, what do you think? I said, it's not for me. And that became The Simpsons. So I just want you to know that it's a good thing to take advantage of those opportunities when they come along, even when you don't think they're coming along. And that, ladies and gentlemen, concludes my life, my career history, to at least up until a few years ago. And it also tells you a little bit about the industry itself. So we're going to sign off as this being PowerPoint number 1, Introduction to Rudd Career. Hope you enjoyed it.